Chapter 10. How Climate Policy Hurts the Poor. The rich pollute, the poor suffer, runs a headline from The Economist. It's true. One of the insidious aspects of climate change is that although it mostly wasn't caused by the world's poor, it will hurt poorer countries more than richer countries. This is partly because the economies of poorer countries are more reliant on industries like agriculture that are vulnerable to climatic changes. It is partly because they tend to be in already warmer climates, and it is mostly because being poor means having less capacity to adapt. Climate change will cost most developed countries a few percent of GDP, which is a problem. But for the poorest countries, and particularly for Africa, this cost can easily end up being much, much more, maybe 10% of GDP. That is a big problem. This unfairness has long been used to argue for stringent climate policy. Cut carbon by up to a third to save the poor, the British newspaper The Guardian was already exhorting a decade ago. But the reality is that today's climate policy does little to tackle the climate-related problems of the world's poor. And it does virtually nothing to help with the vast array of non-climate issues that the world's poor struggle with every day. In fact, climate policies often make life worse, specifically for the poor. This is true both in rich countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, and in the poorest countries, especially those in Africa and Asia. Today's blinkered climate policies are in fact putting the world's worst off countries on a slower path to progress and prosperity. What are we doing in the name of climate? When do people in rich countries talk about the problems in the developing world? When there is a natural disaster. Typically, whatever the catastrophe is, it is blamed on climate change, and commentators are quick to make the case to cut more carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, this is an absurdly ineffective policy. Let's look at the devastating typhoon Haiyan that hit the Philippine city Tacloban in 2013, killing 2,700 people in the city, or 1 in 80 of its 218,000 inhabitants. Built on flat land in an area of the coast notorious for concentrating and amplifying storm surges, Tacloban has seen many disasters. In 1912, a hurricane of similar strength, following almost the same path, destroyed Tacloban and probably killed 6,000 people. But back then, Tacloban was much, much smaller, and it was estimated that 1 in 2 inhabitants were killed. Haiyan got global attention because it hit while the world's climate negotiators were gathered in Poland for their annual UN conference. The Philippine envoy spoke movingly of his grief. According to The Guardian, this made him the face of the UN climate talks and a climate justice star. The diplomat vowed to fast until the world agreed to a solution involving dramatic carbon dioxide cuts. But will cutting carbon dioxide really help Tacloban? We saw earlier that climate change will likely mean fewer but stronger hurricanes. Cutting carbon dioxide will delay these effects slightly, but not reverse them. Even under the most dramatic climate policies, temperature will still rise, only slightly more slowly. Hurricanes will still get stronger, only slightly less soon. Because carbon cuts will only slowly make any impact on rising temperatures, such action will not help one single person today or in the next decades. Cutting carbon, even drastically, would help future citizens of Tacloban, only marginally in the sense that it would push stronger hurricanes a bit further into the future. What if, instead of cutting carbon, we helped Tacloban escape widespread poverty and got more people out from under flimsy corrugated roofs? That would transform the lives of today's most vulnerable, making them more resilient, and of course it would dramatically improve the prospects for future generations. Richer people are, unsurprisingly, more able to invest in adaptation to protect lives and valuables. One 2016 study shows that when income doubles for the average person in a poor community, fatalities from natural disasters will be cut by more than a quarter. What this tells us is that increasing incomes builds resilience. This is why the much poorer Tacloban of 1912 saw a 40 times greater hurricane death toll in relation to the city's population than in 2013. Since the first climate summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the world has talked incessantly about cutting carbon emissions. Imagine if in 1992 we had instead focused on cutting Tacloban's poverty. From 1992 to 2013, general economic progress in the Philippines tripled GDP per person. If we had focused more on poverty reduction, we might reasonably have quadrupled GDP by the time Typhoon Haiyan hit. This would have saved more than 300 people's lives. Climate policies saved zero. Putting it bluntly, choosing climate policies over growth policies doesn't just do nothing. It means more people die avoidable deaths. As Tacloban and other vulnerable parts of the world get richer, inhabitants will be able to build better houses, transport, and infrastructure. Of course, this will raise the costs of property damage when hurricanes hit. Nonetheless, investment in these adaptation measures will mean that a doubling of average income will cause damage as a percentage of GDP to decline by 30%. Moreover, rising prosperity doesn't just mean more money for adaptation. It means more money for education, birth control, and investment. It means less malnutrition and lower infant mortality. Increasing prosperity makes life better for people in all sorts of ways. In contrast, cutting carbon emissions is generally an incredibly ineffective way to improve the lives of the world's poor. Helping them through carbon dioxide cuts, even very dramatic cuts, means the world will still see a significant temperature rise, only a slightly slower one. This means that whatever climate-related worry you try to address will still get worse. It's just that it will be slightly less bad than it could have been. Worried about drought? Cutting carbon dioxide will not reduce drought risks. At best, it will make drought increase slightly less quickly. Worried about floods, heat waves, or the multitude of other possible climate impacts? The same thing happens. At best, you're slowing the problem slightly at a great cost. We need to open our eyes to a broader range of solutions because we know that lifting people out of poverty has amazing impacts. Making people better off over a couple of decades means that any size storm they encounter will cause fewer deaths and less damage. Lifting incomes significantly reduces the damage from any potential climate change-caused increase in hurricanes, droughts, and floods. Moreover, there have always been natural disasters, and there always will be, even if we stopped climate change altogether. Lifting incomes doesn't just help with the increase in natural disasters caused by global warming. It also helps reduce all the damage that would have happened anyway. For the world's poor, climate policies are often worse than ineffective. They are destructive. Take nutrition. Climate activists often point out that higher temperatures will make people more hungry, so drastic carbon cuts are needed. But a comprehensive study published in 2018 in Nature Climate Change shows that strong global action to reduce climate change would cause far more hunger and food insecurity than climate change itself. The scientists used 8 agricultural models covering the entire planet to analyze various scenarios for food security between now and 2050. Similar to how climate change models are used, one economic model might reflect the overly optimistic or pessimistic assumptions of a particular set of researchers, so it's best to look at a broad range of them and at the averages. Overall, these 8 models give us reason for cheer. On average, they suggest that, when disregarding global warming, predicted economic growth between now and 2050 would dramatically reduce the number of people starving, from almost 800 million today to 200 million. But the models also allow us to see the effect of climate change. They show that rising temperatures could mean both lower food production and higher food prices. By 2050, this would put about 24 million extra people at risk of hunger who otherwise wouldn't have been. That sounds like a good reason to aggressively push for climate policies to cut emissions. Strong carbon-cutting policies can indeed potentially alleviate some of this added vulnerability to hunger. If these climate policies had no cost at all, they would reduce the increases in temperature and save about 15 million out of the 24 million extra people who would be starving because of climate change. Unfortunately, as we have seen, aggressive action to reduce climate change is not costless. One of the biggest impacts is on energy prices, which hurt the poor the most. Indeed, the climate policy costs hitting not just households, but also agricultural producers, food manufacturers, and the transport sector mean that food prices are predicted to climb by 110% by 2050. And that would have the total effect of forcing 78 million people into starvation. Which is to say that by insisting on cutting carbon through climate policies that push up food prices, instead of taking a broader view of how to best help people and the planet, we will have consigned 54 million more people to starvation. This is unconscionable. The Paris Agreement is expensive and largely ineffective. It is also going to mean more people left in poverty. A 2019 study found that the massive cost of reducing emissions under the Paris Agreement will lead to an increase in global poverty, compared to what would otherwise be expected of around 4%. The authors issue a stark warning that strong climate change policies could slow efforts to reduce poverty in poor countries. Let's look at the world's poorest continent, Africa, which will be particularly badly hit by global warming. The green and fossil fuel pathways we saw in Chapter 9 once again show two divergent futures, see Figure 10.1. For Africa, instead of a 20-fold increase in incomes from 2020 to 2100 in the green scenario, the fossil fuel pathway would deliver a 33-fold increase. Of course, climate campaigners would immediately counter, but climate change will devastate Africa.
Figure 10.1. African GDP per person for the UN's sustainable and fossil fuel-driven scenarios. The dashed line shows the GDP per person in dollars. Because higher temperatures also mean more climate damages, the solid line shows the welfare left after deducting the cost of climate damages.
Using a regionally defined climate cost model by William Nordhaus, we can roughly identify the total negative impact from climate change on Africa. It is clear that Africa will be hurt the most of any region with global warming, and it will lose even more when temperatures go higher under the fossil fuel scenario. In 2100, Africa will lose 4.1% of its GDP to global warming if we follow the green pathway, and it will lose much more in the hotter world of the fossil fuel pathway with a GDP reduction of 9.9% in 2100. But something else is also clear. While Africans will lose much less prosperity to climate change if we follow the sustainability or green pathway, they will be much better off overall if we follow the fossil fuel pathway. They will be more than 30 times more prosperous in 2100 than in 2020, even after accounting for climate damages, compared to just 19 times better off in the sustainability pathway. By choosing the latter, we would be leaving each African $55,000 worse off every year. The truth is that climate change plays a relatively small role in determining future well-being. It is clear that if we're motivated only by trying to reduce the impact of rising temperatures, we're literally ignoring the most important factors, such as education, health, technology, and access to plentiful energy in Africa's future well-being. Well-meaning climate policies also have indirect impacts. Campaigners used to claim that rising temperatures would lead to more cases of malaria because there would be more warm places where mosquitoes would thrive. We don't often hear this concern anymore thanks to tremendous success tackling malaria directly with insecticide-treated beds, nets, indoor spraying, and treatment, which has halved the number of deaths over the last 15 years. Imagine if we hadn't focused on these simple approaches, but instead put all our efforts into cutting carbon dioxide. We would still have 840,000 annual deaths, 400,000 more than today, while we waited for the minuscule effects of moderate carbon cuts to have any impact. Instead, lifting societies out of poverty is a much more important pathway to eradicating malaria. A study shows that when the average GDP per person reaches $3,100 per year, individuals have enough resources that most can afford to buy drugs to cure malaria, essentially ridding society of the disease altogether. Nonetheless, campaigners for carbon cuts continue to claim that the Paris Agreement is an important way to help tackle health issues like malaria. The World Meteorological Organization devoted a Paris Agreement themed conference to health issues and proclaimed that implementation of the pact was key to improving health, including tackling malaria. Even the illustrious medical journal Lancet published a commentary by two doctors opposing the Trump administration's backpedaling on the Paris Agreement, citing climate change's effect on malaria as one of the health impacts. Yet the Paris Agreement will have no perceptible impact on malaria because it will lead to such a small temperature change. In fact, it is very likely that its total impact will actually lead to more malaria deaths. Certainly, we know this to be the case for the world's previous climate agreement, the Kyoto Protocol. It was found that we had implemented that protocol It was found that had we implemented that protocol for the rest of this century, it would, through lowered temperatures, have reduced the global number of malaria deaths by about 400,000 over the century. Yet higher costs in the rich countries implementing Kyoto would also have meant slightly slower growth for trading partners like Africa, forcing them to linger in poverty longer. The negative impact from lower growth would have caused an extra 600,000 malaria deaths. This perversely leads to climate policies making more poor people die from malaria because they delay the time when nations get rich enough to see the final eradication of malaria. We have been here before, implementing policies that do a huge amount of harm in the name of climate change. 20 years ago, a craze for biofuels swept rich countries, with global production quintupling in the first decade of this century. Biofuels are created with crops rather than fossil fuels, so in principle they do not increase carbon dioxide emissions. Rich countries hurried to institute targets to promote more biofuel use to help cut carbon emissions. The European Union led the way, stipulating member states in 2003 passed legislation aimed at replacing 5.75% of all transport fossil fuels with biofuels by 2010. Developing nations, even those in the grip of famine, were pushed to grow crops for ethanol instead of for food. This movement originally had the full-throated support of many green groups that hailed the shift away from fossil fuels. Yet the negative impacts were much greater than most had anticipated. The charity Action Aid calculated that the amount of crops needed to fill an SUV's fuel tank with biofuel would feed a child for an entire year, and every gallon of biofuel wiped out 40 meals. The huge growth in biofuel inevitably contributed to a reduction in food and an increase in food prices. A confidential World Bank report obtained by The Guardian found that biofuels had forced global food prices up by 75%. The results of the price hike were devastating. After food prices first spiked in 2008, the UN Special Envoy for the Right to Food, Olivia D. Schutter, declared that a silent tsunami had pushed 100 million people into poverty and 30 million into hunger. The World Bank subsequently estimated that between June and December of 2010, an additional 44 million people fell below the extreme poverty line because of food price hikes. Many environmental groups began to soften their support for biofuels or backtrack. Campaigners for stringent climate action were increasingly appalled. Guardian columnist and strong climate campaigner George Monbiot called the subsidies driving the biofuel industry's growth a crime against humanity. Yet by the point of the backtrack, vested agricultural interests had made the bad policies almost impossible to overturn. It seems that we have learned little from this recent history as we plow headlong into new policies that will similarly hurt the world's poor. The truth is that climate policies hurt the poor everywhere, even in countries like the United States, because higher energy prices have a disproportionate negative impact on the poor. Universally, poor people in well-off countries use much more of their limited resources paying for electricity and heating. One 2019 study showed that U.S. low-income consumers spend 85% more on electricity as a percentage of total expenditure than high-income consumers. When climate policies lead to higher electricity prices, this harms the poor much more than the rich. This is one of the reasons why rich elites have no problem saying we should increase gas prices to $20 a gallon. They can easily afford it. Wealth also tends to be clustered in cities where people drive much less. Of course, the struggling single mom in Huntington, West Virginia, has a very different experience. Across the United States, many people are still struggling to pay their energy bills. The International Energy Agency estimates that 9% of Americans, or 29 million, are energy poor, spending more than 10% of their income on energy. This means poor Americans often literally have to forgo other basics in order to heat or cool their homes sufficiently. High energy prices literally kill people, as one 2019 study shows. Researchers looked at the natural experiment that happened around 2010, when fracking delivered a dramatic reduction in costs of natural gas. The massive increase in availability of natural gas drove down the price to heat homes. Cold homes are one of the leading causes of death in winter. There is a strong connection between low indoor temperatures and increased risk of strokes, heart attacks, and respiratory diseases. So reducing the price of heat saves lives. The study estimates that these new lower energy prices save about 11,000 Americans from dying in winter every year. If climate policy is to work, it will drive up prices of energy to reduce consumption. So a climate policy reversing the price reduction due to fracking will drive energy prices back up. People will be less able to heat their homes, and the consequent death rate will go back up. Higher energy prices also hit the poor the hardest in other rich countries. In the United Kingdom, rich households spend 3% of their income on energy, whereas poor households spend 10%. Campaigners celebrate that the UK has seen a reduction in electricity consumption, but this is mostly because costs have soared. Ever more stringent climate legislation made the cost of UK electricity increase by 62% in real terms over a decade, during a period in which average incomes increased just 4%. Not surprisingly, it is the poor who have done almost all of the cutting back, reducing their consumption much more than average, while the richest cut almost none of their much higher electricity use. Higher energy prices hit especially the elderly, who often have to survive on low incomes. One poll in the UK showed that a third of elderly people leave at least part of their homes cold, and 2/3 say they wear extra layers of clothing as a result. In the world's poorest countries, the insistence that we should limit future access to fossil fuels has an even more dramatic cost, because cheap and accessible power is life-saving and one of the best ways out of poverty. Yet many development organizations with a primary goal of helping the poor, including most notably the World Bank, direct more and more of their help to what is known as climate-related development finance, or climate aid. These are nebulous terms, but often what they mean is more money for projects that build solar energy microgrids, and an explicit refusal to fund any fossil fuel-related projects like new coal power plants. Efforts to calculate just how much of global development aid goes toward climate-related projects, see Figure 10.2, makes it very clear that the percentage increased drastically from about 2005.
Figure 10.2. For every dollar spent on aid to the developing world, the number of cents that go to climate purposes.
Climate aid does only a little good. Remember the Indian village of Darnai, Chapter 7, where the villagers wanted real electricity that could power their refrigerators, stoves, and also the lights in the morning? In general, studies showed that aid spent on solar panels and other climate initiatives generates some of the smallest benefits compared to other aid investments in nutrition, health, gender, education, and infrastructure. The International Energy Agency expects that 195 million people will have access to energy for the first time in the next decade. That is great, but they will get very little power, mostly because the focus is on getting them off-grid solar rather than on-grid, mostly fossil fuel-based energy. Indeed, they will on average get just 170 kilowatt hours per year. That is half of what one U.S. flat-screen TV uses in a year. Consider what your life would be like with access to nothing but 170 kilowatt hours. It is not enough to power a factory or a farm, so it cannot reduce poverty or create jobs. It won't even be enough to hook up a stove and a heater to combat the fire-created smoke and pollution that claims 1.6 million lives annually. It's not even enough to keep a refrigerator running. For the world's poor, this level of energy access is hardly transformational. In contrast, a study in Bangladesh has shown that grid electrification, which in Bangladesh and much of the world mostly means using fossil fuels, has significant positive impacts on household income, expenditure, and education. It means households newly introduced to grid electrification experience, on average, a 21% jump in income, and over a period of 9 years, a 13% reduction in poverty. Unfortunately, many of our political leaders have decided that when spending on aid for the world's poorest, climate change concerns trump poverty. That calculation is wrong and is undermining the claim to helping the world's poor. In one 2016 study looking at energy options for Bangladesh, researchers found that building more coal-fired power plants would generate global climate damage costing around $592 million over the next 15 years. But the benefits from electrification would be almost 500 times greater at $258 billion, equivalent to more than an entire year of the nation's GDP. By 2030, the average Bangladeshi would be 16% better off. Denying Bangladesh this benefit in the name of reducing the impact of climate change is fantastically arrogant. For every 23 cents of global climate damage that we could avoid, we are asking Bangladesh to forego $100 of prosperity and development. And Bangladesh is a nation where energy shortages cost an estimated 0.5% of GDP, and around 21 million people live in extreme poverty. From the comfort of the World Economic Forum's 2017 annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, former U.S. Vice President Al Gore tut-tutted about plans to build coal-fired power plants in Bangladesh. But Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina slapped that down, pointing out, if you cannot develop the economic conditions of your people, then how will you save our people? We have to ensure the food security. We have to give them job opportunity. Sheikh Hasina is right. Choosing expensive carbon-cutting policies or insisting on green development approaches might seem like an easy choice for the world's elite in Washington, D.C., or Paris, France. But the burden of these choices falls unfairly on the world's poor, and especially on those living in abject poverty. They need more energy, not moralizing from the West. It is perverse to hear rich people piously claim that we should help the world's poor by cutting carbon dioxide to make their future slightly less worse, when we have huge opportunities to make their lives much better, much more quickly, and much more effectively. If you are poor, you will be less able to build a strong house to withstand hurricane-level winds or flooding. You will be less able to buy an air conditioner to adapt to rising temperatures. But if you are poor, you will also lack resources to save your kids from easily curable diseases, to keep them well nourished, to educate them, to house them in a safe neighborhood, to ensure they are not exposed to air pollution. The list goes on. The truth is that poverty sucks. Exposure to natural disasters caused by climate change is just one of many ways that it sucks, and it happens to be one of the ways where we can help the least, even when spending trillions. And when we spend lots of resources on climate, there is less money left to tackle all the other problems facing the poor, problems where we can help much more. Today, there are about 650 million extremely poor people in the world. As a thought experiment, let's consider what it would cost to lift all these people out of poverty. As a caveat, let's just remember that lifting people from, say, 90 cents a day to just above $1.90 is great, but they are still pretty darn poor, and actually distributing the money would be fantastically expensive. It turns out that the theoretical cost to lift everyone on the planet out of extreme poverty would be less than $100 billion per year. Compare this to our current trajectory. We've just committed to spending $1 trillion to $2 trillion a year just on the almost entirely ineffective Paris Agreement. Every month, the cost will be the same as the amount that could lift everyone from extreme poverty. This strikes me as obscene. As rich countries commit to going carbon neutral, the cost will escalate to tens of trillions of dollars per year to make a small temperature change in a century's time. Just a couple of days of these new higher costs could transform the world by ending extreme poverty entirely. Climate alarmism, too often leads us to policies that, while well-intentioned, crowd out much more effective ways of helping people. It comes down to this. When we see a malnourished child or a town hit by a hurricane and seriously suggest that we should make lives better by cutting a ton of carbon dioxide, we're not actually trying to do good, but rather imposing our own priorities on people who have little power to assert their own. It has become too easy to believe that policies aimed at cutting carbon are the answer to everything. They're not, and we need to stop campaigning for and enacting policies that will have the world's poorest paying for our mistakes. 30 years of climate policy have failed to rein in temperature rises or reduce carbon intensity. The amount of carbon dioxide we emit for every unit of energy produced. All the well-meaning personal actions undertaken in the rich world, like buying electric cars or becoming vegetarian, amount to little more than gestures. Far more importantly, the Paris Agreement has put us collectively on a pathway toward incurring gigantic costs, especially for the poorest, with next to no climate benefit. Thus far, humanity has excelled at showing how not to fix the climate. We have spent 3 decades trying the same deeply broken approach over and over. Politicians lurch from one climate summit to the next, with climate campaigners urging them on to make even more ludicrous promises. Enough is enough. There are smart policies that can tackle climate change and help make the world better. These are what we'll turn to in the next section. So there's a footnote I didn't realize was there. Back when he was talking about how many people would be consigned to starvation, the footnote here says, in fact, I just told you the story without carbon dioxide fertilization because this story sounds more normal. If we include carbon dioxide fertilization, as we should, strong climate policy becomes an even more risible solution to hunger. The net impact of climate change will actually be beneficial because carbon dioxide fertilization drives down food prices more than temperature drives them up. In total, global warming will mean 11 million fewer starving in 2050. Trying to limit climate change by cutting carbon dioxide will no longer solve a problem, but actually prevent a benefit. Of course, aggressive climate action will still increase prices and drive more people into hunger. Under these more realistic assumptions, climate policy is no longer a solution and will in total cause 77 million more people to starve.